Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is a lecture that I want to give about cognitive biases. Uh, Cognitive biases are phenomena that psychologists talk about, but they're also things that philosophers talk about because they're the sorts of things that have an effect on the formation of our beliefs. They interact with our systems of belief and knowledge and the like, and so they're of interest to philosophers as well. And the short idea, the rough idea is this, that a cognitive bias is uh, a subconscious phenomenon that plays a role in the formation of our beliefs. Okay. And to the extent that it's subconscious, it's something to be avoided, right? Because the thought is, well, what would be a good cause of my believing something? Well, it would be something like, at least in the philosopher's ideal, it would be having a good reason to believe in a thing, right? What is the cause of my belief that there's a God, or that knowledge is valuable, or that two things can't occupy the same space at the same time, or whatever, right? According to the sort of classic philosopher's paradigm, for anything that I believe, the sort of proper cause of that belief is my having some good reason to believe it. Okay. And a bias is really by definition not a good reason to believe something. It's this kind of force that's leading me toward the adoption of some belief, but which is operating below the level of reason, right? It's operating sub-rationally, or irrationally, or non-rationally, or something like that. So the goal, of course, is to avoid these biases. Um, the point for our purposes really today is that they, despite their to be avoidedness, are really ubiquitous. They're very common. They're in many ways very natural for humans to fall into. And so the goal here today is really just to identify some of these popular sorts of biases, um, and to drive home the point that critical reasoning is about trying to avoid these traps. Right? They're basically shortcuts for arriving at beliefs unthinkingly. Okay. Okay. Bias number one: the belief bias. The belief bias. The idea here is that um, we have a natural inclination to accept arguments based purely on what the conclusion is, without even looking at the argument itself. Okay, and again, this is sort of by definition irrational, right? The rational part, the reasoning part, is the argument for some conclusion, and so if I'm just ignoring that and jumping straight to the conclusion, then I'm acting irrationally, right? Um, so I think this sort of thing happens all the time. You turn on CNN, and some person who identifies as a Democrat or as a Republican, or as whatever, is giving some argument for something, and you hear the conclusion that that person is arguing for, and maybe because of some alignment between you and that person in terms of political party or whatever, or some sort of orientation, you're predisposed either to like the conclusion or to dislike the conclusion. And so you will therefore accept or reject the argument as a whole, just based on your feeling about the conclusion. Okay. Um, but the whole point of doing philosophy, really, the whole point of trying to get clear about critical reasoning, is to get into those details, right? There are good arguments for true conclusions. there are good arguments for false conclusions. There are good arguments for conclusions that you like, and there are good arguments for conclusions that you don't like, right? And of course, by the same token, there are bad arguments for things that are true, and there are bad arguments for conclusions that are false. Bad arguments for things that you like, bad arguments for things that you don't like, right? Now, we care about getting to the truth. We do, of course, care about the conclusion, but we want to, again, have good reasons for accepting or rejecting these conclusions. And so we're going to care about these premises and their order and their relationship, both among themselves and to the conclusion, before we try to accept or reject an argument in sum. Okay. There are, for example, in the classical tradition of the philosophy of religion, for example, religion in the West, there are lots of famous arguments for the existence of God. Okay. And, most of these arguments were sort of bandied about by people who already believed. It wasn't a matter of trying to convert the unconverted or anything. It was really just about, sure, we all believe in God, but I want us to have a good reason for believing in God, right? Can we somehow prove the existence of God from first principles, right? Because what philosophers care about is not so much whether you believe in a thing or not, but why, right? Do we have a good reason to accept this thing? Okay. Cognitive bias number 2, the false consensus effect. Okay. False consensus effect. The tendency that many of us have to assume falsely that there is a consensus among us. The tendency to assume that many people in the room, or the other people in the room, or most of the people in the room, believe the same way that I believe. Right? It's an assumption of a consensus when in fact that's probably false. Presumably this is based on some more raw psychological tendency to assume that you're just like everybody else, or maybe a desire to be like everybody else. I'm just like everybody else. Probably most people think the way I do. Right? I mean, again, these things are operating subconsciously, but very likely we could tell some evolutionary story about why we have these sort of latent psychological impulses. So the false consensus effect. Here's a sort of relatively sophisticated example of this. A long time ago, an old colleague of mine named Paul Teller was teaching a course on the philosophy of science. And I think it was like an honors undergraduate class, philosophy of science. And he articulated this highly controversial view in the philosophy of science called various things, physicalism or reductionism. And this thesis says that ultimately everything in the universe can be reduced to physical description, can be reduced to things that are talked about by physicists. And this is controversial for some obvious reasons, I guess. I mean, on the one hand, you might think, well, chemists talk about different entities from the entities that physicists talk about. Chemists talk about molecules and atoms and substances and chemical reactions and things like that. And physicists don't talk about those things per se, but molecules are really just made up out of atoms, and atoms are really just made up out of these more fundamental particles. And very likely we can explain a lot of what's happening in chemistry simply by appealing to the more fundamental bits that make up the entities that chemists tend to talk about. Okay. And similarly, you might think in biology, well, biologists talk about different objects too. They talk about things like plants, animals, and viruses and species and the like. But those things too are just made up out of materials, and those things are made up out of chemicals, and those things are made up out of these more fundamental bits of matter and so on. And so if biology is applied chemistry and then chemistry is applied physics, then biology ultimately too, by a sort of transitivity of reasoning, would be applied physics. And you start to think, well, maybe everything is applied physics, right? And this is the thesis of reductionism, that everything reduces to physics. That when we're talking about neurons or animals or rocks or airplanes, well, we're really just talking about physical stuff. And so, there's no reason in principle why a physicist couldn't ultimately explain everything. And that's the thesis of reductionism. But of course, on the other hand, there's room to resist, because you might think, well, now wait a minute. Can the behavior of some organism or some species really be explained totally in the terms of subatomic particles? Can the way that plants exhibit phototropic effects by sort of reaching out toward the sun from dark corners of the jungle, can that be explained in terms of behaviors of subatomic particles rushing around in this kind of invisible fog? What about larger macroscopic things, like the way that certain human societies behave, or economies, or markets? And what about distinctively human phenomena like feelings of love or fear? Are those things really just physical objects at the bottom? Is my fear just a matter of a peculiar sort of tugging of my brain in certain directions, accompanied by some electrochemical rushes between my brain and other parts of my body? It doesn't, maybe that's often going on when I have fear, but surely it's not straightforward to think that the fear itself is somehow to be identified with the behavior of subatomic particles, right? Okay, so enough buildup. So this is the controversy surrounding physicalism or reductionism, right? Can everything be described in physical terms or not? Again, on the one hand, you want to say, well, sure, everything's physical, but on the other hand, but it seems like there are macroscopic systems that exhibit behavior that's very hard to describe or explain in the terms of subatomic physics. Okay, so Paul Teller sort of puts this view out there and is expecting this nice, lively discussion, but he's not getting it. There's nobody saying anything. Silence in the classroom. And Paul Teller is wondering why this is happening, and he's sort of looking around the room, and finally says, well, doesn't anybody want to say anything about this? This is a pretty controversial view, and I thought we might have a discussion about it. And it eventually is revealed that half of the people in the class weren't saying anything because they thought reductionism was clearly false, and so they thought, well, this view is hardly worth talking about. It's clearly false. Surely everybody in this room thinks it's clearly false. I don't know why Paul Teller is bringing this up. And the other half of the room was thinking of the exact opposite. They were thinking, well, of course, everything is physical. This view is clearly true. It's not really worth discussing. Surely everybody around me agrees with me that this view is true. It's not worth discussing. Okay, so there were indeed different beliefs in the classroom, but the holders of these different beliefs had come to that conclusion. Had come to the conclusion that this thing wasn't worth talking about because of the false consensus effect, right? Everybody was assuming that everybody around him believed the same way that he did, and so there was no engagement on this issue, even though it's really quite controversial. Okay, that's the false consensus effect. Cognitive bias number 3, the bandwagon effect. Okay, the bandwagon effect. This is in some ways similar to, and in fact easily confused with, the false consensus effect, but it is different. So in the case of the false consensus effect, you just assume that other people around you believe as you do. The bandwagon effect describes a slightly different phenomenon whereby one is inclined to believe as the other people around him do. Right? So the sort of causal order is different, right? Between the false consensus effect and the bandwagon effect. In the bandwagon effect, I'm exposed to beliefs of people around me, and just because they're the beliefs of people around me, I can be inclined to believe the way that they do. This happens all the time. I often think of cases where some charismatic, strong speaker, leader, personality type will say, well, I believe blah, 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 and to a group of people, and everybody will say, oh, yes, of course, we all believe that, and, I'm interested in the cases where they're not just saying that, right? They really do believe it, but they believe it for totally irrational reasons, right? They believe it just because of the sort of power and charisma of the person or persons around them who have expressed their beliefs. One sort of natural application of the bandwagon effect is in Rorschach tests. Okay. Well, if Rorschach tests were done publicly, right? So a Rorschach test, for those of you who don't know, is the psychologist's test where a psychologist holds up an ink blot, ink in some suggestive but vague shape, and shows it to you and says, "What do you see here?" And then you're supposed to say what you see in that shape, and something about your response is supposed to reveal something about some of your inner psychological states or something like that. But the Rorschach test, if it works at all, can work only privately, right? You must be the only person in the room. Imagine doing these things publicly, right? A psychologist holds up an ink blot to a room full of people and says, "What do you see?" Probably one person would say, "Well, I see a bicycle." And then everybody else in the room would very likely jump on that bandwagon and say, "Oh, yeah, I see a bicycle." Right. And they may very well genuinely believe that they see a bicycle, but not because they've given it an honest analysis themselves, but only because they've been influenced by, right, the person around them, subconsciously, irrationally influenced by the person around them who spoke up first. The old Magic Eye 3D things were like this too, right? If you remember these puzzles, these sort of optical illusions consisting of a simple pattern. Right? It would look like just a sort of repeating pattern on a page, but if you were able to focus in the right sort of way, on a point behind the image or in front of the image or something, you would get this image of something quite different, right? Of a ship or of a house or something like that. And again, same opportunity for the bandwagon effect to kick in, right? Suppose someone is holding up a Magic Eye puzzle and says, "Look, it's a sailboat," and then everybody looks at it and says, "Oh yeah, a sailboat. I think I see a sailboat too." Right? And again, they're not forming this belief based on actual visual cues. They don't really have good reasons for believing this. They just have heard the testimony of people around them, and are jumping on the bandwagon. Okay. Cognitive bias number 4 is the in-group bias. And this one's probably extremely familiar. This is the tendency that many of us have to favor the people we judge to be inside of our group and to disfavor the people we judge to be outside of our group. Okay. And naturally enough, groups can be defined in all sorts of ways. Group is a very vague term, and that's on purpose because we can have favorable opinions about people who share the same sex as us, or the same gender as us, or the same race as us, or the same religion as us, or the same school as us, or the same team as us, or the same fan club as us, right? I mean, groups are sort of everywhere. This is what politics is all about. And it's very easy to form positive opinions of people who are in your group just because they're in your group, and to form negative opinions of people who are outside of your group just because they're outside of your group. Right? I mean, this is why that racism and sexism and the like have been problems for the whole history of humankind. This is why we have problems with that sort of thing, is the in-group bias. Right? I'm antecedently disposed to like this person because he also roots for the Cincinnati Reds in just the same way that I do. But that guy over there, he roots for the Los Angeles Dodgers, so I don't like him as much, right? And of course, I don't. That's the only thing that's sort of influencing my judgment about something, subconsciously, irrationally, right? I'm not even doing it consciously, right? I'm just letting these external factors influence my judgment. That's the definition of bias. Cognitive bias number 5, obedience to authority. We have the tendency as human beings to obey authority. That is, to believe people we judge to be authorities. To believe that we ought to believe the way that authorities believe, to believe that we ought to do the things that authorities tell us to do, and so on. There was a famous series of experiments done back in the 60s and 70s by Stanley Milgram at Stanford. And one of his experiments was about well, basically he was trying to give an account of how the Holocaust could have happened. And he was interested in explaining how is it that a whole nation of people could have been complicit in the deaths of millions upon millions of undesirable people in their country, Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and Catholics and all the rest, right? How is it that that could have happened? And he designed an experiment that went as follows. He had people in a room, and there would be a person wearing a sort of white lab coat and looking very official. This is the authority. Okay, and he'd pull somebody in off the street, and the person in the white lab coat would say, "Oh, please have a seat. Thank you for participating in our experiment. What we're doing is we're running an experiment to explore the power of electric shock treatment. And so what I want you to do is just sit down here at this electric console here, and I want you to flip this switch. On the other side of this room, on the other side of this wall, is somebody who's hooked up to the other end of this circuit board, and he's going to feel some electric shocks. And that's what we're exploring is sort of the relationship between electric shock and human behavior and so on. And so if you go ahead and flip the switch, and the person would flip the switch, and then on the other side of the wall, the test subject would hear somebody saying, "Ouch," "Hey, stop," right? And gradually, the figure in the white lab coat would say, "Okay, we're gonna increase the voltage a bit. So I'm gonna turn up the dial a little bit now. Please flip the switch again." And so the test subject would flip the switch again, And the person on the other side is, well, hey, that really hurts now. Please stop doing that, right? And slowly the person in the lab coat would ask that we keep increasing the voltage, and the screams from the other side of the wall would get louder and more piercing. Now, really, right, unbeknownst to the test subject, there really wasn't any electric shock treatment going on at all. The person on the other side of the wall was part of the experiment as well, and was in on it, and was just, acting as though he'd been shocked for the purposes of the experiment. But the point was to see how many people, or if any people, who, when confronted with this situation, namely of having an authority figure ask you to hurt somebody else, how many people would go along with this, right? How many people would be willing to keep sending the electric shocks even as the voltage cranks up, even as the screams from the other side of the wall get louder and more severe, right? And in fact, the results were that many people did indeed keep shocking the person on the other side of the wall, because of the semblance of authority vested in this person who was wearing the white lab coat and saying, this is an important experiment. Please continue with the experiment. I know that you're hearing some screams and shouts from the other side of the wall, but please ignore those. It's important that we keep running this experiment, and so on. And lots of people would go along with this. Now, there were exceptions. There were people who would say, "I'm sorry, probably your work is very important to you, but I can't keep hurting this other person on the side of the wall," and they would stop. But in general, the results were that there was nothing in particular strange about the way the Germans acted in the 30s and 40s. Most people are inclined to be obedient to figures whom they judge to be authorities, and that's a dangerous thing, right? I mean, again, we're talking about a sort of bias. We're talking about a subconscious, irrational force that affects your beliefs independently of your reasoning faculty, right? You decide that the words of this authority figure are trustworthy. You decide that you ought to do as the authority figure says, based only on the sort of appearance of this person. And again, the decision isn't even conscious, right? You're just sort of naturally inclined to follow this person's orders. The obedience to authority effect is usefully contrasted with a totally legitimate enterprise in forming beliefs, which is trusting in authority, right? It is reasonable to believe the physics professor, the physics researcher, when she says that the Higgs boson has been discovered, and we now have a more complete model of the ultimate structure of the universe. Right? Now, you don't have to know anything about Higgs bosons or bosons in general or the ultimate structure of the universe to believe reasonably that indeed the Higgs boson has been discovered based on the testimony of this expert. Right? She is an expert. You have reason to believe her, and there's nothing really wrong with that, right? The issue rather is when you're jumping to conclusions based only on some appearance of authority, without investigating your sources, without making sure that the people you think are authorities really are authorities, and so on, right? You wouldn't just take the word of anybody who's wearing glasses and a white lab coat, right? You want to have some good reasons for thinking that this person who presents herself as an expert really is an expert. Right? That's the point. And that demands critical reasoning, right? That demands sort of conscious engagement with the person, with the topic, with the claims being discussed, and so on. Okay, and finally, cognitive bias number 6, the overconfidence effect. I'm saying there are 6. There are really many, many more. If you go take a psychology class, I'm sure you could learn about scores of other, maybe even hundreds of other cognitive biases. But I'm just talking about 6 that really tend to come up a lot, and I think are worth discussing. So my 6th and final cognitive bias in my by no means exhaustive list of cognitive biases is the overconfidence effect. And this is the tendency that most of us have to be overconfident, right? To rate ourselves more highly than other people. Maybe nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than on that old show American Idol, which probably many of you have watched, where it would often happen that someone would get up in front of the judges to sing in the early rounds, in the audition rounds, and that person would just be terrible, right? Would have really no singing talent at all. But even after hearing that from the judges, would insist, oh no, I'm good. I know I'm a good singer. Everybody tells me I'm good. I don't believe you, right? You authorities, even though you are clearly authorities and it matters this time and I should listen to you and so. I know I'm good, right? And I have this kind of illusion in my own abilities. Another example is if you give a survey to people in a room about how they would assess their own driving ability. Right? Almost invariably, more than half of the people in the room will rank themselves above average drivers. Okay. And of course, that can't really be true that most people are above the average. That's not how an average works. Right? So that's another situation where we tend to believe without reflection, right, without thinking about it, that we're better than average at some skill or other. Right? That's the overconfidence effect. Now, I think the overconfidence effect is also worth contrasting with a sort of nearby interesting phenomenon, which is that sometimes it's good to be overconfident, right? I mean, maybe this isn't really a different phenomenon. Maybe the point now is just that even though it's irrational, even though it's a case of this cognitive bias, there might be practical considerations that sort of justify it in a way, right? Maybe it's good for me to be a little overconfident in my driving ability when I get behind the wheel of a car, right? You don't want drivers out there who think that they're not good at driving, because when you think you're not very good at driving and you're driving, then you're not going to be very good at driving, right? Driving well does take a certain amount of confidence. Singing well does take a certain amount of confidence. So there is a kind of practical side to this that complicates matters. It is good to be confident, maybe even a little overconfident, because that confidence can matter, right? It can affect how well you perform at the skill that's at hand. So I have officially nothing more to say about that. Because for our purposes in this class, we're interested in more theoretical considerations, right? And from a more theoretical point of view, well, it is still irrational to believe that you're a good driver when you're basing that on nothing, right? When you have no evidence at all, or at least none that you've collected, none that you're consciously thinking about to point you in that conclusion. Now, it may be that practically speaking, it makes sense for us to have this inclination and so on. Maybe practically speaking or evolutionarily speaking, it makes sense to have uh, bandwagon effect tendencies as well, or maybe even in-group bias tendencies as well, right? But again, I'm a philosopher, right? I'm interested in the sort of theoretical aspects to these things. And speaking theoretically, all of these biases, as biases, are fundamentally irrational, right? And are therefore subject to scrutiny. They're therefore things that we ought, at least in a perfect world, modulo practical stuff, to avoid, right? They're things that we ought to be avoiding. They're things that we ought to try to eliminate from ourselves. Classically speaking, theoretically speaking, purely philosophically speaking, and that's what I like to think about, we ought to have reasons for the things that we believe. And if we genuinely have reasons for the things that we believe, then we are not being influenced by bias, right? We're believing things on their merits. We're believing things because of arguments that were convincing, because of evidence that we have, and not for anything else. Certainly not for reasons that operate below the level of our rational faculties. Okay, the PowerPoint slides will speak for themselves, I hope, and I think that's it for now. See you next time. Thank you.